A quiet Christmas dinner, laughter echoing in the room, when suddenly, boom! A daughter exposes her father's affair with her own aunt. The room freezes, hearts shatter, and secrets spill out like never before. But that's not even the most shocking part of the story. What happened next? You won't believe it. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. What would you have done in her place? Now, let's get into the story. The house was filled with the warmth of Christmas. The tree sparkled in the corner, gifts were piled high, and the dining table was decorated with candles and festive plates. Susan, like everyone else, believed it would be a night to remember, but not for the reasons she had hoped. Her family had always been close, or so she thought. Her father was the center of every celebration, cracking jokes and keeping the mood light. Her mother, ever the gracious host, had cooked all day, ensuring everything was perfect. And then there was her aunt, Linda, her mother's younger sister, who had been a part of every family gathering for as long as Susan could remember. Linda had always been the fun, carefree one in the family, the one who brought laughter to the room. But that night, Susan couldn't laugh along. She couldn't even meet her father's eyes, because she knew something no one else at the table did, something that had been eating away at her since the moment she found out. Her father, the man who had always preached loyalty and family, was hiding a dark secret, and worse, that secret involved Aunt Linda. As the night unfolded, Susan sat in silence, her thoughts racing. She had uncovered the truth just a week ago, completely by accident. A suspicious message on her father's phone had caught her attention. It was short, but unmistakable. "I'll miss you." She brushed it off at first, thinking it must be a misunderstanding. But then she noticed how often her father and Linda exchanged glances, how they whispered just a little too often. The pieces began to fall into place, and Susan decided to dig deeper. What she found was worse than she had imagined. Text messages, receipts, even photos. Proof of an affair that wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It had been going on for months, right under everyone's noses. Susan felt sick to her stomach, but she didn't know what to do. Confronting her father privately didn't seem enough, not when her mother deserved the truth. But could she really destroy her family on Christmas Eve? Susan's heart raced as she thought about it. The betrayal wasn't just about her father's actions. It was about Linda too. Her aunt wasn't just another woman. She was family. Someone her mother trusted completely. How could two people so close to her mother do something so cruel? And now, as the family laughed and toasted around the table, Susan couldn't hold it in any longer. The decision had already been made. This secret would come out tonight. As the family passed dishes around the table, Susan's hands trembled slightly, but she hid it well. She had always been the quiet one, the one who avoided conflict. But tonight, silence felt like betrayal. Her mother deserved to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Her father was in the middle of a story, gesturing animatedly with his hands, drawing laughter from everyone. Even Linda joined in, her smile as carefree as ever, as though she had nothing to hide. The sight of them, sitting so comfortably as if nothing was wrong, made Susan's stomach churn. She stared at her plate, the words swirling in her mind, fighting to come out. But fear held her back. What if no one believed her? What if this tore the family apart forever? These questions lingered for a moment, but they couldn't outweigh the anger and disgust she felt. Finally, as the laughter died down, Susan's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Dad," she said firmly, her eyes locking on his, "do you want to tell everyone why you've been sneaking around behind Mom's back?" The room went silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself has frozen. Her father looked at her, stunned, his usual confidence slipping. "What are you talking about, Susan?" he asked, his voice calm but his face pale. Susan didn't flinch. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. She turned to her aunt, whose smile had vanished. "And you too, Aunt Linda. How long were you planning to keep this up?" Linda's eyes widened and she stammered, I don't know what you mean." Her attempt to feign innocence only fueled Susan's anger. Her mother, seated at the head of the table, looked between them, confusion and concern etched on her face. "Susan, what is going on?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Susan took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table. This was it. The moment she had dreaded but knew was unavoidable. She couldn't stop now. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "Dad and Linda have been having an affair. I've seen the messages. I have proof." Gasps echoed around the room, followed by stunned silence. Her mother's face drained of color as she stared at her husband, her voice barely a whisper. "Is this true?" Her father opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Linda looked down, her hands shaking, and in that moment, Susan knew. She had shattered the facade. There was no going back. The silence lingered, thick and suffocating, until her father finally spoke. "Susan, this is ridiculous," he said, his voice low but laced with panic. "You don't know what you're talking about." Susan didn't blink. "Don't lie," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. "I saw the messages, Dad. You've been meeting Aunt Linda behind Mom's back, and I have the proof to show it." Her father's face turned pale, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He looked at Linda, hoping for support, but she was frozen, her eyes locked on the table. Susan's mother sat in stunned silence, her trembling hand covering her mouth as tears began to well in her eyes. "Messages. Proof," her father stammered. "What proof, Susan?" "You've got this all wrong." Susan didn't hesitate. She reached into her bag, pulling out printed screenshots of text messages, messages that left no room for doubt. She handed them to her mother, her hands shaking only slightly. "Here," she said quietly. "You deserve to see this." Her mother hesitated, her eyes darting between the papers and her husband. Slowly she took the pages, her fingers trembling. As she read the messages, her expression shifted from confusion to devastation. Her voice cracked as she whispered, You did this to me?" Her father tried to interject, reaching out toward her. "It's not what it looks like, I swear," he said quickly, his voice pleading. Susan's mother slammed the papers down on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Not what it looks like?" she snapped, her voice shaking with rage. "These messages aren't harmless, and you know it. How long has this been going on?" Linda finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "It was a mistake," she murmured, tears streaming down her face. "It just happened." Susan's anger boiled over. "A mistake," she said, her voice rising. "A mistake doesn't last for months. A mistake doesn't involve sneaking around and lying to everyone who trusts you." The room felt like it might explode, the air thick with accusations and heartbreak. Susan's mother buried her face in her hands, her sobs the only sound in the room. The rest of the family, who had been sitting in stunned silence, began whispering amongst themselves. The once festive atmosphere had turned into something unrecognizable. A broken family staring at the cracks that could never be mended. Susan's mother slowly lifted her head, her tear-streaked face filled with a mix of hurt and fury. Her voice was quiet but piercing. "How could you?" she asked her husband, each word dripping with disbelief. "After everything we've built, after all these years, with her..." Her father, unable to meet her eyes, stammered, "It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Susan couldn't hold back anymore. "Go this far," she said, her voice rising. "You didn't mean for it to happen. But you kept meeting her. You lied to Mom over and over, and for what? To ruin everything. Linda finally looked up, her face pale and streaked with tears. "It's not all his fault," she said softly, her voice trembling. I let it happen too." Her confession sent a fresh wave of shock through the room. Susan's mother's eyes locked on Linda, her voice shaking with rage. "You let it happen? You're my sister, my own blood. How could you betray me like this?" Linda's tears fell harder, but she didn't respond. The guilt weighed on her, but it was nothing compared to the destruction she had caused. Susan's mother turned back to her husband, her voice rising. "And you? How long has this been going on? Tell me the truth, or so help me." Her father sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his secrets had finally crushed him. 6 months, he admitted, his voice barely audible. "It's been 6 months." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, and muttered curses filled the air as other family members tried to process what they were hearing. Susan's mother's fury flared. 6 months? You've been sneaking around with her for half a year while pretending everything was fine? Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" Susan jumped in before her father could respond. "And it's not just about the affair, Mom," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I found something else, something worse." The room went silent again, all eyes on Susan. Her mother looked at her, confused and scared. "Worse? What do you mean, worse?" Susan hesitated for a moment, her chest tightening as she prepared to drop the second bombshell. "This isn't the first time," she said, finally, her words slow and deliberate. "Linda has done this before, with another married man. This is who she is." The collective gasp was louder this time. Linda's face turned ashen, and she opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. The family erupted again, some in disbelief, others angrily questioning how this could have been hidden for so long. Susan's mother looked like she had been struck. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Is that true?" she asked Linda, her eyes pleading for it not to be. Linda dropped her gaze, her silence confirming everything. At that moment, Susan's mother's heartbreak turned into something sharper, an unrelenting determination. "You," she said, pointing at Linda, her voice cold and steady, "are no longer welcome in this house. And you," she said, turning to her husband, "don't even think about coming near me tonight. We're done." The cracks in the family were no longer cracks, they were gaping chasms, and Susan knew the night was far from over. Linda stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, but her legs wobbled as if they could barely hold her. "Please listen to me," she said, her voice desperate and cracking under the weight of the accusations. "I made a mistake. I don't know what I was thinking. I never wanted to hurt anyone." Susan's mother's glare could have frozen fire. "You didn't want to hurt anyone," she said, her tone sharp and cutting. "Do you even hear yourself, Linda? You didn't just hurt me. You've destroyed this family. And for what? A cheap, selfish affair with my husband." Linda flinched at the words but stayed silent. The room felt heavy with unspoken anger and disappointment. Susan's father finally spoke, his voice weak and unconvincing. "This doesn't have to ruin everything," he said, his words aimed at Susan's mother. "We can fix this. I'll end it with her, and we can move forward." Susan couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. "Move forward? After what you've done? Do you really think it's that easy?" She shook her head, her anger bubbling over. "You didn't just betray Mom, you betrayed all of us. How can you expect anyone to trust you again?" Her father turned toward Susan, frustration creeping into his voice. "I made a mistake, Susan. People make mistakes. That doesn't mean you get to sit there and act like you're perfect." Susan's eyes burned with fury. "This isn't about being perfect. This is about you pretending to be this loving father while lying to all of us. Do you even care about what this has done to Mom?" Her mother, who had been silently sobbing, suddenly stood up, her voice shaking with raw emotion. "Stop!" she said, her eyes darting between her husband and Linda. "I don't want to hear another word from either of you. You've both said enough." Her father tried to reach for her, but she pulled away, her voice now cold and resolute. "I can't even look at you right now. I want you out of this house, tonight." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words sinking in. Susan's father opened his mouth to protest but closed it again, knowing there was no point. He turned to Linda, his face a mix of regret and guilt. "Maybe it's best if we both leave," he muttered, avoiding everyone's eyes. Susan's mother crossed her arms, her voice unwavering. "Do whatever you want. Just don't expect to come back." Linda hesitated, looking around the room as if searching for someone to defend her, but no one spoke. Even the relatives who had been whispering among themselves stayed quiet, their disapproval clear in their eyes. Finally, Linda grabbed her bag and walked toward the door, her head hanging low. Her father lingered for a moment, as if hoping someone would stop him, but the cold silence made it clear no one would. He gave Susan a final look, a mix of anger and sadness, before following Linda out of the house. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the room didn't lift. If anything, it grew heavier, suffocating everyone left behind. Susan's mother sat down again, her face pale and drawn. "I don't know how we move forward from this," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Susan sat beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out, Mom," she said quietly, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her own doubts. The family had been shattered, and the pieces felt too jagged to ever fit together again. But deep down, Susan knew this wasn't the end of the story. There was still more to come. The hours that followed were quiet, but the silence was heavy. The rest of the family sat in scattered groups, whispering amongst themselves, too afraid or unsure of what to say. Susan stayed by her mother's side, watching her stare blankly at the wall, lost in her own thoughts. It was as if the warmth and joy of Christmas had been drained from the room, replaced with the cold reality of betrayal. Susan's uncle, Linda's husband, was the first to speak up. His voice was rough, barely masking his anger. "I can't believe this. All this time she smiled in my face while doing this. How could I have been so blind?" He slammed his hand on the table, causing a few dishes to rattle. Susan turned to him, her voice low but firm. "You're not the only one, Uncle Dan. None of us saw it. She fooled all of us." Dan scoffed bitterly. "Fooled? Or maybe we just didn't want to see it. Maybe we all ignored the signs because it was easier than facing the truth." This struck a nerve in the room. Everyone shifted uncomfortably, as if silently questioning whether they had played a part in ignoring the cracks that had always been there. Susan's mother finally broke her silence, her voice soft but filled with pain. "I should have known," she said, shaking her head. Looking back, there were moments, small things that didn't feel right. The way he always defended her, the little inside jokes. I told myself it was just how close they were. I never thought it was this. Susan squeezed her mother's hand gently. "Mum, don't do that to yourself. This isn't your fault. It's theirs. They made their choices and they hurt you. Hurt all of us. That's on them, not you." Her mother nodded weakly, but her eyes remained distant. "I just don't understand how someone you love, someone you've built your whole life with, can do this to you. Wasn't I enough? Wasn't our family enough?" Susan felt a lump in her throat. She had no answer, no way to take away the pain etched on her mother's face. It was in that moment, as the room sat in a haze of sadness and anger, that one of Susan's cousins spoke up, a young girl, barely in her teens. Her voice was quiet but clear. Why didn't Aunt Linda say sorry? The simplicity of the question cut through the tension, and everyone turned to look at her. She didn't even say she was sorry, the girl continued, her brows furrowed in confusion. Doesn't she feel bad for what she did? The room fell silent, the weight of the observation sinking in. Susan realized the girl was right. Linda had left without a real apology, without acknowledging the destruction she had caused. Susan's uncle shook his head. People like Linda don't apologize. Not really. They just make excuses, try to justify their actions. Saying sorry would mean admitting they were wrong. Susan's mother let out a bitter laugh, and admitting they were wrong would mean they care about someone other than themselves. The conversation hung in the air, leaving everyone to sit with their thoughts. Susan could feel the anger and sadness bubbling inside her, but more than anything, she felt an overwhelming need for justice, not revenge, but a reckoning. This wasn't the end. She wasn't done yet. The next morning, the air in the house felt heavier, as if the weight of last night's revelations still lingered in every corner. Susan had barely slept, her mind replaying the confrontation over and over. She glanced at her mother, who sat silently at the kitchen table, staring at a cold cup of tea. The heartbreak was etched into her face, and it made Susan's resolve stronger. But as Susan scrolled through her phone that morning, a notification caught her attention. It was a message from one of her cousins who hadn't been at the dinner the previous night. The text was short but alarming. I heard what happened, but there's something else you should know about Aunt Linda. Susan's heart skipped a beat. She immediately called her cousin, desperate for answers. What else could there be? Hadn't they uncovered enough damage already? Her cousin hesitated on the other end of the line before finally speaking. I didn't want to say anything before, but Linda did something similar years ago. I overheard Mom and Dad talking about it once. Apparently she had an affair with someone at her old job. He was married too. It caused a lot of drama, but she managed to sweep it under the rug. The revelation hit Susan like a punch to the gut. So this wasn't just a one-time betrayal, it was a pattern, a habit. Linda hadn't just made a mistake, as she had tried to claim last night. This was who she was. Why didn't anyone say anything? Susan asked, her voice rising. Her cousin sighed. You know how it is. People don't want to stir the pot, especially when it's family. They probably thought it wasn't their business. Susan hung up the call, anger boiling in her chest. How many times had Linda done this? How many families had she hurt while hiding behind her easy smile and friendly demeanor? Without thinking, she stormed into the kitchen and slammed her phone on the table. Mom, she said firmly, breaking the silence. There's more. Linda has done this before. She had an affair years ago at her job with another married man. Her mother looked up, her eyes widening in shock. What? She whispered. Susan sat down beside her, her voice steady but filled with anger. I just found out. She's done this before. She didn't just betray us. This is who she is. She's been doing this for years, Mom, and she gets away with it because no one ever calls her out. Her mother's face hardened, the sadness in her eyes replaced by something sharper. She's a coward, she said bitterly. A selfish, manipulative coward. Susan nodded, and it's time she faced the consequences. That day, Susan decided to confront the rest of the family with what she had learned. The truth needed to be out in the open, no matter how painful it was. Linda had caused enough damage, and Susan wasn't going to let her slip away without taking responsibility for what she had done. Not this time. By afternoon, the family was gathered again, this time in a much tenser atmosphere. The festive decorations felt out of place, a stark contrast to the raw emotions simmering beneath the surface. Susan's mother sat quietly in the corner, her face a mask of exhaustion and pain. The rest of the relatives whispered among themselves, the shock of the night before still fresh in their minds. Susan stood in the center of the room, her resolve unshaken. She looked at the faces of her family, people who had trusted Linda, admired her, even looked up to her, and knew they deserved the full truth. This wasn't just about last night. It was about years of lies and betrayal. "Before we move on from what happened yesterday," Susan began, her voice firm, "there's something else everyone needs to know." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Susan could feel the weight of their anticipation, but it only strengthened her determination. "Linda has done this before," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a knife. "This isn't the first time she's had an affair with a married man." Gasps rippled through the room, and the murmurs began again, louder this time. Linda's husband, Dan, who had been sitting quietly with his head in his hands, looked up, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice low and trembling. Susan didn't flinch. "I'm saying she's been doing this for years. She had an affair with someone at her old job, a married man. It caused a lot of drama, but she kept it quiet, just like she tried to do with this." Dan stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Is this true?" he demanded, turning toward Linda, who wasn't there to defend herself. Susan's mother, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up, her voice cold and steady. "She's not here to lie her way out of this, Dan," she said, "but we all know it's true. Look at what she's done to this family. Why would this be any different?" Dan's face hardened, his hands clenching into fists. "I trusted her," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I built a life with her, and this is what she does. She destroys everything she touches." Susan's mother nodded, her expression grim. "Welcome to my world." The tension in the room grew heavier as the rest of the family processed what they had heard. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered angrily about Linda's actions. But one thing was clear. Any sympathy they might have felt for her was gone. Susan took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know this is hard to hear, but we can't keep sweeping this under the rug. Linda has hurt too many people, and she keeps getting away with it because no one calls her out. Well, I'm calling her out. She doesn't deserve our silence, and she doesn't deserve our forgiveness, not until she owns up to what she's done." The room was silent again, but this time it felt different. There was a collective sense of agreement, a shared understanding that Linda's actions couldn't be ignored anymore. Susan's mother stood up, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "I don't know what happens next," she said, looking around the room. "But I know one thing. Linda will never set foot in this house again. And as for him—" Her voice broke for a moment as she glanced at the empty chair her husband had left behind. "He's not coming back either." Susan felt a surge of pride as she looked at her mother. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time it felt like they were taking the first step toward healing. The days following the confrontation were filled with a mix of sadness, anger, and quiet reflection. The house felt emptier, quieter, like the air had been sucked out, leaving behind an unsettling void. Susan stayed close to her mother, watching as she tried to navigate the wreckage of her marriage. Her father had not returned as promised, and Susan's mother had made it clear he wasn't welcome. Linda, too, had gone silent, though Susan had heard whispers from other family members that she had been trying to justify her actions to anyone who would listen. "She's calling it a mistake," Susan's mother said bitterly one evening, staring into her cup of tea. "As if that erases everything she's done, as if I should feel sorry for her." Susan shook her head, her anger still fresh. "She's not sorry, Mom. People like Linda don't feel guilt. They just try to escape it. That's why she's been able to do this again and again. She avoids the consequences, and then she moves on to the next family to destroy. Her mother sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping under the weight of it all. I keep asking myself what I missed, what I could have done differently, but I guess it doesn't matter now, does it? Susan leaned forward, her voice firm but gentle. Mom, none of this is your fault. You gave everything to this family. Dad and Linda, they're the ones who broke it, not you. The words seemed to comfort her mother, if only slightly. But Susan knew this pain wouldn't go away overnight. It would take time, time to heal, time to rebuild. Meanwhile, the family as a whole was struggling to find its footing. Some relatives had cut Linda off entirely, furious at her betrayal. Others remained silent, unsure of where to stand in the aftermath of the chaos. But it was Dan who surprised everyone. A few days after the dinner, he showed up at Susan's house, his face etched with determination. I'm filing for divorce, he said bluntly, standing in the doorway. Susan's mother, who had answered the door, looked at him with a mix of shock and understanding. Dan, are you sure? Dan nodded, his expression unwavering. I can't stay married to someone like her, not after everything she's done. She's lied to me, betrayed me, and made me question everything I thought I knew. I won't let her do it again. Susan, who had been listening from the kitchen, stepped forward. I think you're doing the right thing, Dan, she said honestly. It's not easy, but you deserve better than this. Dan gave her a small, grateful smile. Thanks, Susan. And thank you for having the courage to speak up. I know it wasn't easy, but you did the right thing. You saved me from wasting more of my life on someone who didn't deserve it. The words struck Susan deeply, filling her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. Maybe, just maybe, exposing the truth had been worth the pain it caused. That night, as Susan and her mother sat together in the living room, the quiet felt less heavy. There was still hurt, still anger, but there was also a glimmer of hope. The truth had come out, and while it had broken the family, it had also set them free. A week had passed since the Christmas dinner that changed everything, and while the dust was starting to settle, the scars were still fresh. Susan's mother had begun packing away some of her husband's belongings, boxing them up with an almost mechanical detachment. It was as if she was trying to erase his presence from their home, piece by piece. Susan watched her silently, unsure of what to say. She knew her mother was hurting, but she also saw a strength in her that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but it was growing. Mom, Susan said softly, breaking the silence. How are you feeling? Her mother paused, her hands resting on the box she was sealing. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me feels empty, but another part of me feels relieved. Does that make sense? Susan nodded. It does. You've carried so much for so long. Maybe it's time to let some of it go. Her mother sighed, a bittersweet smile forming on her lips. I just wish it didn't have to happen like this. But you're right. It's time to move forward. That evening, Susan decided to take a step of her own. She sat down at her desk, pulling out the folder of evidence she had gathered, the text messages, the receipts, the proof of her father's betrayal. It was painful to look at, but she knew it couldn't stay with her forever. She called her cousin, the one who had shared Linda's past with her, and asked for help spreading the truth. People need to know, Susan said firmly. Not just for us, but for anyone else she might hurt in the future. Linda can't keep walking away from this. The next day, whispers began to circulate among the extended family. Details of Linda's past surfaced, and the full extent of her actions became impossible to ignore. Relatives who had once defended her now turned their backs, disgusted by the pattern of deceit and betrayal. Susan's father, meanwhile, attempted to reach out, sending messages that ranged from apologetic to defensive. But Susan and her mother didn't respond. His words felt hollow, like an echo of a man they no longer recognized. As the days turned into weeks, Susan began to notice a shift in her mother. The heartbreak was still there, but so was a quiet determination. She started making plans, joining a community group, reconnecting with old friends, even looking into a part-time job to keep herself busy. "I'm not going to let this define me," she told Susan one evening. "I've spent too many years putting everyone else first. It's time I start living for myself." Susan felt a swell of pride and relief. For the first time in weeks, she could see a light at the end of the tunnel. The family wasn't the same, it never would be, but they were finding their way, and Susan knew that as long as they had each other, they would be okay. In life, betrayal can come from the people closest to us, shaking the foundation of trust we build with them. But as painful as it is, confronting the truth is the first step toward healing. This story reminds us that ignoring or hiding from the truth only allows hurt to fester. Standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult, can bring clarity, closure, and the chance to rebuild. Betrayal doesn't have to define us. What matters is how we choose to move forward, finding strength in our resilience and valuing the relationships that truly matter. Sometimes, breaking ties with those who harm us is necessary to protect our peace and rebuild our lives. And through it all, we must remember, self-worth and dignity should never be compromised, no matter the cost. What would you do if you were in Susan's place? Would you have the courage to speak up and protect the ones you love?